Let's go. All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another episode, another round. Everybody gets drinks all around a PT Pintcast. Today, we're diving deep, getting to the bottom of the pint into the world of musculoskeletal health with someone who's done this before and been doing it for a while. The mastermind behind Confluent Health, a powerhouse in private physical therapy, digital health, education, occupational medicine, and provider network management. That's all I could get out on one breath. There's more. With more than 700 outpatient PT clinics under his belt, our guest today's influence in the profession that we're in is nothing short of monumental, and I'm not overusing that term. Plus, his Twitter handle is the envy of almost all physical therapists who use the platform. Let's say cheers to none other than Dr. Larry Benz. Larry, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you, Jim. I really appreciate it. Thanks for the very kind, warm intro. It's a pleasure watching what you've accomplished with this podcast and other things that you've done. So thank you for all the work you're doing as well.
Well, thank you. Well, we get the hard question. The hardest question is always first, what are we drinking?
Well, we're drinking. People are going to be surprised, but I'm a Miller Lite guy.
Okay.
So I'm a Miller Lite guy. Love the taste. I'm the anti-beer snob. Now, when it comes to wine, I'm a little bit more discerning. Bourbon, I drink Old Foe, which is one of the cheapest bourbons you've got. But Miller Lite, it's won a bunch of awards. It says right on the bottle, a fine Pilsner. Lists all the awards up here on the label. And then its quote is quality, uncompromising, and unchangeable. Yes. Now, how could you beat a beer? It's got that, Jimmy.
You can't. And see, I like this is I always like, I like what I like. You like what you like.
Yeah.
And by changing what I do based on what someone else likes feels disingenuous. The funny part is I did a lot of that in my 20s, not 20 somethings. But then all of a sudden I realized, why am I doing this? Why not do the thing that I like, even if it upsets someone else? Here's the funny part. Most of the time, other people don't care.
They really don't. In fact, they get a kick out of it. I go to places like Austin, Texas a lot on Rainy Street. You go to these places, 100% of the beers are craft beers.
Yeah.
And it's really, really impossible for me to distinguish. So I just always ask, what is the one that's most like Miller Lite? And they give me some type of Pilsner, usually a lager. So it makes things easier. I'm a big believer in decision fatigue. And so when it comes to beer, there's not a lot of decisions for me to make.
Decision fatigue was famous, or I think the first person I learned about the term was Steve Jobs. I think a lot of people learned about decision fatigue from Steve Jobs, where he just said, I've got, a bunch of black turtlenecks and jeans and these plain sneakers. And people are like, but you're worth $1 bajillion. Why don't you have this and this and this? And I think he just went full circle on me. He's like, because I like this and it works. And I want to pay attention to other things. No,
that's exactly right. I think it plays out in different people, different ways. For some, it's their dress. For some, it's the way they choose to eat. I know people eat the same thing for lunch every day because they don't want that decision. I do think when you're an executive level or have a lot of decisions to make, being mindful that your decisions are like a muscle and they can be subject to fatigue. So be careful with it.
I do that with breakfast. I know about me that I can't really do anything terribly creative until 10 o'clock in the morning. So it's 2 eggs, scramble them up, a little bit of cheese, a little tortilla, and it's a breakfast burrito, and I'm fine. And some people will say, but variety is the spice of life. And I said, but for breakfast, it's not all food. Breakfast, I understand that. And it sort of removes that from my plate, and I can focus on other things. And I've learned this from other people where focus is often, I was taught an example, it's like a flashlight. You only have so much of it, and it can only see so much. So when you remove some things from your plate or the darkness that you don't need to pay attention to, the things that you do, you can give more focus. Focus is it's tangible. You can run out.
No, that's exactly right. I look at a bunch of things that way. Not only decision making, I also look at willpower. And how do you avoid having to exert too much willpower? Because at some point that will also give out. It does in all humans. And again, it manifests itself differently. So don't put yourself in a position where you have to fatigue it. A lot to it.
Yeah, people will talk about that. Like, how do you, there's a common theme, and we'll get to themes. I promise. We didn't plan that we were going to go in this direction first, but I think there's a common trend right now that everybody wants to hack something. So like biohacking, schedule hacking, the daily routine. What does this CEO do? The first 5 things they do in the morning. I should adopt those things. And one that I saw that actually worked, because I try a couple of these things, was understanding the first 3 things I'm going to do tomorrow. So if I get up and I sort of walk around the house, it's like, well, I could clean that. I could mow the lawn. I could get these emails done. I could do a lot of things. But what are the 3 things I should be doing? And the person had framed it up, should versus could. In this day and age with our tools, we have a lot of coulds. But at the end of the day, I need a lot of those, or at least the 3 most important shoulds being done.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. The way it manifests for me is I look at it as a return on my energy investment.
Yeah.
Will that give me a return in excess of that energy that it takes to do or adopt something new? I think routines and all that stuff is great. And I think the thing that makes us distinguishedly human is ability to personalize habits, rituals, routines to ourselves.
Right.
And find out what works for us.
Right.
And to think that that's going to work for everybody is naive.
Yeah. Absolutely. All right. Well, I said the hardest question comes up first. Miller Lite. I am a man as well. I do like, trying some other beers, but when I'm hanging out in the summer and it's something easy, it's a Miller Lite, it's a Coors Light, it's a Mick Ultra. So, cheers, Larry. Thanks for coming on the show.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, cheers.
First round brought to you by Owens Recovery Science, our friends Johnny Owens and the team, owensrecoveryscience.com. If you're looking to get certified in personalized blood flow restriction rehabilitation training, I have never know where Johnny is. He lives in Texas, but he flies around the world to people BFR. So if you're looking,
he's great. We use his products and have the military connection with him personally. So no, I'm a big fan.
Yeah. All right, let's start. We mentioned trends a second ago. As where you sit in the profession now, and we can go backwards through your career, you've sort of done a lot of things. You've gone up, down, left, and right. You've got a unique perspective now on your experience, the things, the people you interact with, the things that you get to do. What are some of the significant trends you're seeing right now in our profession, knowing that things come and go, and by the time the first person listens to this episode, or the 10,000th time someone listens to this episode, those things will change, because we know the only constant is change. But what are some that you see specifically in physical therapy practice? What are some of the trends that you actually think are significant?
Yeah, so I think there are 2 sides of a coin. On the very, very positive side of things, physical therapy is in. It is fashionable. We are in soap operas, we're in movies, and we are in social media. Yeah. And everybody loves their physio, loves their PT. That is fantastic. Unfortunately, the dent that we have made is about 10 to 12% in musculoskeletal health. So all your aches, pains, sprains, and strains of the world, we're at best 12% of them. And so as fashionable as we are, the amount of growth that we have in our future is unbelievable. I mean, we are capturing 12% of a market that we should at least capture statistically 95%, because the other 5% need to go mercy to surgery, all those kind of things. So that's very, very exciting. The flip side of that coin is, if we get what we want and what we deserve and what we're good at, how are we going to accommodate the influx of patients? We have a mass shortage, and this shortage has been around for a while. It was disguised pre-COVID, but it was there. COVID accelerated shortages in all healthcare professions, particularly PT, where it was reported about 15 to 20,000, depending on whose numbers you believe, sat out. Most of them didn't come back. Now, I'm old enough to remember the balanced budget amendment years and years ago, where they drastically changed the reimbursement for physical therapists, occupational therapists, and speech in a nursing home setting. And there was a massive number of therapists that were laid off during those days. And during those days, less than a third of those PTs came back to work. So I've seen this cycle before. It's just a little bit different. The problem is we're only graduating about 12,000 new graduates a year. But it's 12,000 that don't all even sit for their exam. Right. It's 12,000 that certainly don't all do clinical work. Many of them work remotely. Many of them don't even work in a clinical sense whatsoever. And that's okay. But we do not have enough to answer the call of trying to get from 12% musculoskeletal health to 95%. So how can we accommodate that? And accommodating that through omnichannel means, multimodal ways, variety of things that we could talk about. But the education challenge has me the most concerned at night, because we've had an incredible drop in the number of applicants in physical therapy programs. About 70% of all PTs who apply to PT, or students who apply to PT school, now get accepted into PT school. I'm from old school days where less than 10, 15, 20% would get accepted in. We saw the same phenomenon happen in law schools, where many law school programs are not being, their entire class is not being, if they have 100 slots or 80 slots, it might be at 50 or 60, 70% of that. It's a real challenge in law. And it's a good analogy for PT, because what ends up happening is we have to lower our admission standards.
Right.
And so we're taking students that are probably less academically prepared than they've ever been in the past. Now, I'm okay with that. If they've got the passion, the drive, and the hunger to become a good PT, that's all good. But the reality is, out of that 12,000, let's say there's really a pool of 10,000 therapists. Out of that 10,000, you got long-term care, which is, rising like crazy, and for good reason, home health, acute care, other settings. You're maybe leaving 3,000 to 4,000 at best for the outpatient world, the world that I live in for musculoskeletal health. It's not the only PT world, obviously, but it's what my main concern is. And so this shortage is going to be around for a long, long time. Now, years ago, we had a similar phenomenon, and me and some others postulated that our best and brightest were not going into PT school, because at that particular time, we saw them migrate to technology fields and finance fields and financial technology, fintech type stuff. And PT school went from 2 years to 3 years. So all of a sudden, you have this education creep.
Right.
It was driven by higher ed. It was not driven by our profession. And so you're now going to get out at 7 years, best case scenario, and starting salaries are, the $70,000 range. So the reality is, we saw this coming years ago. And so me and some colleagues said, let's reduce PT school from 3 years to 2. And we did. And we've done it very successfully. People thought we were crazy at the time. We knocked on hundreds of doors.
I was going to say, how was that received?
It was, the two themes that have underscored my career. I remember I was a military therapist. I went into private practice. And I remember the biggest naysayers when I went into private practice were my colleagues, were other physical therapists. Oh, you're going to go into private practice. Are you money grubbing capitalist? What you shouldn't do that. Healthcare shouldn't have, be owned. So that was, when it got to this education thing, our colleagues were our biggest nightmare. We had academics writing letters to the accreditors saying, you can't possibly do 2 years. We had all kinds of people laughing at us and calling us names and throwing rocks at us. And then we'd go on the steps of higher education, and we got no's by so many colleges. And we finally found one that was ready to take a little risk, which was South College down in Tennessee, a for-profit. And now we have one program there that's got 2 cohorts a year. It's 200 students, and we've opened up in Atlanta. We'll open up in Nashville with them. At the same time, all the ones who did this with me were all from Baylor, John Childs and Tim Flynn and Rob Weiner. And so Baylor took us on, and they said, we'll do it once you get accredited, because it's very difficult to get accredited as a 2-year program. When you're trying to do hybrid learning techniques, it's very, very difficult. Again, this is all 9-10 years ago, so well before COVID. COVID hits, and now all of a sudden, every academic faculty member who used to say, never, ever, ever over my dead body will I teach an online course. Well, you know what? During COVID, you're teaching an online course, you're going to be terminated. And so they all pivoted, if you will. Right. Most did it very poorly, by the way, because there's a different skill set that allows an instructor to teach online. Just like a therapist needs a different skill set to do, telehealth than they do in clinic setting, or additional skill sets, I should add. And so today, as we speak, there are about 13 to 15 programs that are 2-year programs out of approximately, 300. So we barely moved the needle. And, the reality is there's not enough motivation for most schools to reduce their tuition cycle from 3 years to 2, right, even with declining enrollments. So then you say, well, how can we, correct the program? Well, Dr. Rick Shields, who's a tremendous research scientist out of University of Iowa, who's just been incredible in the neuro world, has started to apply his research techniques to higher ed, and particularly PT school. And one of the things he found is that the net present value, when it gets to about what it is in PT, about 85, 86,000, people migrate towards nurse practitioner and PA and pharma, and in some case, veterinary medicine. The idea being that for the same amount of schooling, those who are really interested in the healthcare field are going to go to those where it's a little bit less schooling or about the same, and the starting salaries are much higher. And so we have this, 100, and then the other figure to keep in mind is what I call the 150 Mendoza line. And that basically is at $150,000 of student debt. As a profession, you're no longer an attractive profession. Right, wrong, or indifferent. Artificial line, is it true in every case? No. So what you do have, though, is many less applicants is the end result of this.
Sure.
So how could we change this? Well, one of the ways we can change it is to change our mindset about a physical therapist's education, curriculum, and training. And it's my contention that midway through their education, whether in a traditional 3-year program that would be at 18 months, at a 2-year program it would be at a year, you would sit for the first part of your state boards. You would have underlying, being able to do clinical exam, understand clinical prediction rules, understand clinical guidelines as promulgated by the Orthopedic Physical Therapy Association of the APTA. And you would have a competent set of skill set. You get a master's degree, sit for your boards. It's contingent upon you finishing the balance of your DPT. At the end of that DPT, you get full licensure. But the difference is, as a licensed therapist during that time, you could bill for your services. Because the problem we have now is we have a faith, hope, and prayer technique for training therapists. We send them out to anywhere who wants to take students, and we try to make them clinically ready. Well, here's the other interesting phenomenon. Pre-COVID, when there wasn't as much of a shortage, there was still a shortage, but not as profound. Lots of practices stopped taking students. We limited the number of students in a lot of our places to certain academic programs, just because we could, capacity. Well, then what happened is when the shortages came out, everybody said, well, a technique for getting more students, they're getting recruiting, is to take on more students. So we've actually, in a way, diluted, liquidated, dummied down to a certain extent, even the educational training of our current PTs. But if they took their licensure exam, you'd be able to bill, they'd be able to see Medicare patients, you'd be able to pay them. You'd be able to pay them a modest amount, maybe 50, 60% of a starting PT. You'd also be able to add revenues to your clinic, and that amount would lower their, it's like paying student athletes, right? It would lower their educational costs overall. So I think that's one idea and one thing that to be considered. The other major challenge that I just alluded to is now we're getting students who've graduated, this 12,000, that's really probably 10, and then on an outpatient basis, really 3 or 4, and their clinical readiness is at an all-time worst. And so we're seeing new graduates, and this is not their fault. This is not an accusation towards the students. It's an accusation towards the system. We're not training them to be clinically ready. And so to bring them up to par to where they can see a full load of patients could take weeks and months and more mentoring and more remediation and more level setting. And so lots of therapists, we have all these residencies around the country. We have the largest residency in the US, but the numbers are down because the base therapists coming out of 3 years are coming in burned out. Sure. And now we have to mentor them and remediate. And so lots and lots of challenges going on in there. And so I think, when you ask me that question, that's the first and the foremost thing that comes to mind.
What would need to change to make that possible? Your idea of halfway through your education, either at 12 months or 18 months, would it be you need to advocate for rules change? Is it academia? Is it where is it? Who would
it's a combination of things. You'd have to get a meeting of the minds together, an unholy alliance consisting of CAPTI, of APTA, of the Academy of Academics, ACAP, and and certainly the Federation of State Licensure Boards, because in order to take an exam, you have to have a degree. And so you'd have to, get agreements that you can do that at a master's degree level, and that their DPT would be contingent upon that. It's not any different than what happens in med school when they start sitting for boards during their second and third year. It's just a takeoff on it and creating more of a traditional medical model or proven medical model, rather than the system we have now, which is it's 3 years, but 6 months of it or a year of it is throwing them out to an uncertified group of clinics that is completely removed from an academic. And so it is, if I take an academic position, it's very unnerving to send your students out to a non-academic setting and expect similar results from practice to practice. And so if you talk to any of the better PT programs across the country, they can tell you at the tip of their tongue what are the 4 or 5 programs that they really want their students to be trained in.
And that is, as you mentioned, not at random, but it's at the mercy of who has availability and who is willing to take students at that time. And then, I knew this from being in PT school, just listening around now, is by the time you get there as a student, that therapist you were paired with might not be there anymore.
No, that's exactly right. And then you throw in the regulatory side of it. They've got to learn a new EMR every time. Yeah. They've got to learn the new rules of the trade at that particular, clinical practice. And all these things happen. And what happens is, as an employer, they land on our desk needing more training, burned out, lost their zest for the profession, and they haven't even started their career yet. And so those are the, challenges, and they're not going to go away easily. And so how does it manifest itself in the workplace right now? Well, the average PT, according to some survey data, lasts about 8 months on their new job.
Wow, really?
Yeah, that's down from 9 months from a few years prior. And look at the retention rates. The retention rates are, at best you're seeing, 15 to 25% of the staff, and these are therapists that are less than, call it, a year and a half of graduation, going on to bigger and other things.
All right, let's combine the last two things we talked about, which is programs can never go hybrid. It can happen. And then a pandemic comes and it's necessity is the mother of invention. And, oh, look, we can do that. And this thing that you're proposing, what would need to happen to actually make this thing a reality? Is there some dynamic change? You said, getting an alliance, this unholy alliance, but what could cause it? Because I feel like everybody is in alignment in terms of wanting to better the profession, and how everybody decides that happen is, of course, can be vastly different. But is there something that can be a catalyst to move the profession so we don't burn students out and we make them better clinicians?
Yeah, well, those are two very different things. We could talk about burnout separately because those are very different dynamics. But to get to where it costs them less or they result in less student debt, we're going to need to put these meeting of the minds. It's going to take leadership from each one of those levels, the private practice level vis-a-vis the private practice section, and the great leadership that Mike has done there. You also have the APTQI, which is the Quality Alliance, and that consists of a lot of private equity-backed and public company PT companies. It's significant, it's profound in terms of size. You get leadership from APTA, leadership from CAPTI, leadership from the Academy of the academics on the PT side who helped to write the curriculum, and the Federation of State Boards. And you got to get them in a room and drive consensus, and then have that consensus drive their constituency groups and get everybody on board. I'm convinced it could be done, but it's going to take effort, time, certainly some resources, certainly some money. But the end result is we need to be attractive as a profession, number one, to get our applications up. The only way you make it more attractive is two ways: less student debt or more salaries. Well, the reimbursement climate is suddenly not going to wake up one day and say we're underpaying PTs.
Right.
So that only leaves the lever arm of decreased tuition and or remuneration for the PTs while they're in school. I have tons of colleagues, granted I'm a little bit older, I went through the military's program, but I have tons of colleagues that when PT was a 4-year degree, their last 2 years was PT school. A lot of employers paid 100% of it then.
Wow.
And they went and they had a commitment to go work for them. Now we do a commitment and we pay for their residency because it's a year or 18 months, but we can't pay for 3 years of PT school or 2 years of PT school at the tuition rates. Higher education is a broken system, in my opinion, for a lot of reasons. They rely on endowment, student tuition, and philanthropy as their revenue sources, and those are going away. And what happens is they try to make margin in graduate school programs. So they charge a lot more for PT and for dentistry and for veterinary and for the others. And so they expect those margins in those programs to subsidize their losses that they might have in certain programs on an undergraduate level. So we're victims to a certain extent in a higher education theater of absurdity pool right now.
Yeah. You mentioned your career in the military. What's a lesson or something you learned during that you still, use today?
Well, I love the military system because it was extremely well organized. You certainly didn't have to worry about reimbursement. And for that matter, most of the compliance rules that they place on every other, on all the non-governmental organizations. And you really, truly had the patient's best interest at heart. We were musculoskeletal evaluators then, so we had direct access. We had prescriptive authority. We had the ability to get x-rays. We were truly looked at as a collaborative partner with the orthopedist who didn't want to see garden variety low back pain. They only want to see surgical candidates. And so that inverted system, which we're now trying to see in the private sector, was the lesson I learned is that it works.
Yeah. Yeah, it's important. And you hear a lot. There's many loud voices and getting louder and saying, how do we get closer to this model? Yeah. We have proof that this thing works.
Exactly.
There's great research coming out that supports that. So hopefully that's a victim of time, and hopefully time will change that.
No doubt. No doubt.
So Larry, I believe that social media is a tool. Some people will say it is good or bad. I was actually involved in an Oxford debate a few years ago. And the question was, is social media is it hazard? That was the prompt. It was carefully worded. Is social media hazardous to the profession of physical therapy? And then I was placed on the pro side. I had to say it was hazardous and then build my argument towards that. So I still stand by that. I still think it could be hazardous. Like a hammer could be used to build a tool or to do harm on somebody. But I do think it's a tool, and I like that analogy. You can use it to see things like a telescope, to test something, to connect, to learn. It's more like a Swiss Army knife, in my opinion, if used correctly. So how do you use social media? And I got to know the backstory behind how you got in at the ground floor, right? The first person to get, the right URL for a website has got a great corner on the internet. You got at physical therapy on Twitter. I want to know.
And at physical therapist on Instagram. I can get to those stories, but I think in general, the way I'm an old guy, so I use social media just for primarily fun and to promote the profession and to promote some of the interests that I'm at. I don't use it to have transparency on what's going on in my life and what I'm eating and where I'm at every given day. It's just not who I've always been much more of a private person in that respect. Although I've got great friends who are the opposite of me and do it absolutely a different way. And I believe that you have the ability as a human being to be distinguishing, and we have cognitive skills that allow us to say, what's the best movie to watch? Well, you should apply that same thinking to social media, and you have to determine whether it is information or misinformation. And that's where it can be harmful. I have seen a lot of physical therapy self-promotion where it's stuff that's not backed by research or evidence. So we have to be careful about it. In terms of how I got the name physical therapy, it's interesting. Many years ago, I used to go to the TED conference every year, particularly when it was in Long Beach. And this is years ago, and just a tremendous amount of fun. And I remember at the time, there were only 2 people from the whole state of Kentucky that were going to that conference. And they did a variety of events where you tried to meet one another. And back then, you would have your name, and you were never allowed to promote any kind of business or anything, but you'd have 3 things that you were interested in. And they'd have these little cocktail parties. And right in front of me at one of the cocktail parties was a gentleman, and he ordered a Maker's Mark. Well, I'm from Kentucky, and so thinking he orders a Maker's Mark, we have some conversation to talk to him about. We turned around, and his name was Evan Williams. And I said, oh my gosh, your name is Evan Williams, and you've just ordered a Maker's Mark, because Evan Williams is a bourbon name as well. It's owned by Heaven Hill. It's a pretty good bourbon. Same people who make Elijah Craig, same people who make Larceny. Some people make Old Fitzgerald. Really, Heaven Hill is just a tremendous company, one of the few that's still locally owned here in Kentucky. And so I started talking to him about Maker's Mark, his name being Evan Williams, and invariably, what do you do? How'd you get here? Well, I used to work at Google. I started this blogging software. Now I've just left Google, and I started a new thing called Twitter. We just exhibited it at the South by Southwest thing it was literally like a few weeks ago. And he was telling me a little bit about it, and in my head was spinning like, I don't quite get this, but this guy seems really smart. Yeah. And so I immediately, after that cocktail party, went back to my room. I think back in those days, you had to do the plug-in with the, just get to the internet. I signed up on Twitter and signed up as at physical therapy. So that's how I got at physical therapy. The physicaltherapist.com was legit, very early days. We were the first company back then to have a website. So we reserved physicaltherapist.com with my friend Rick Schutz. And then my own company back then, which was called CORT, K-O-R-T, Kentucky Orthopedic Rehab Team. We literally, I think, were the first PT practice to have a website. So we tried to be early adopters of technology, more out of interest level than anything else. And then I don't know how it happened on Instagram. I guess I signed up pretty early, because I that may have been a stroke of luck to get a physical therapist there. I was not an early adopter of Instagram like others that I know.
I consider myself pretty innovative as I pay attention to things like that. But it shows that you leapt before you understood fully. You understood what the buy-in needed to be. You were going to go to a website. You were going to spend some time. You were going to pay attention, right? Spend and pay attention time. And before really understanding it, because really, if you want to look at it, the only way you can really understand something is sort of by banging on it and kicking the tires and taking it for a test drive. So you had that connection with a human, and you were able to say, I don't really know what this is, but the barrier to entry is 15 minutes of my time.
Exactly.
And you were lucky enough to say, well, all right, if I'm going to give myself a handle, if I'm going to have a stamp somewhere, why not use the word of the profession? If only, I think if only more people were able to say something like that or operate that way, and kick the tires of things, instead of saying, well, what's my 5-year plan with this? Unless I know that, sometimes we can over prepare.
That's right. Innovation. No doubt about it. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. So you're involved in education. So I always love asking people who pay attention and focus on education. What are some things outside of the profession that really excite you right now? And I don't want to give it a medium. It could be a book, a movie, a podcast, anything. But what's something right now that you are using as a tool to educate yourself anywhere in your life?
Well, you'd have to be under a rock if you didn't mention AI and all of the different offshoots from it. Again, very early adopter of ChatGPT, very early adopter of even the preliminary ones before that, before they were large language models. I have been trying to use it in my writing. I've been trying to use it in other things, to construct emails. I used it to help cast some scripts of some movie films that we do in our company-wide for the last few years over certain sort of psychological topics. I've had great success with it. I'm intrigued by how it can impact our profession. It's very difficult to take an unregulated medium and put it in a regulated medium. The part that scares me about PT is not AI. I think AI can come in and artificially scrub records for compliance and take that off our chest. I think it could artificially come in and do all of our notes. That's not a problem. But will our industry and will CMS and Medicare and the other payers allow these things to be done? And can we match the fields that the EMR says they have to be in with what the AI is trying to put them in? And so the constraints are not the technology, the constraints are the regulations. And so my genuine hope is that our younger therapists will benefit tremendously, because death by 1,000 clicks is very real. I would say if you're taking burnout at its core, loss of zest, feeling like you're not professionally getting ahead, that what you're accomplishing isn't making a dent in the universe. If we can eliminate the regulatory constraints and documentation suck up that in Medicare takes up 25% of your time.
Wow.
I talk to my friends in education. They have the same complaints in the sense that, it isn't teaching kids that I don't like. It's the reports I have to give back to my boss or to the system makes me do all of these, so-called process improvement plans that have nothing to do with the core, in that case, teaching, or in our case, applying to patients. It's really sad that we think it's good if a PT can see, let's say, 10 to 12 patients a day. Well, the only reason when I was in the military, we saw a lot more than 10 to 12 patients a day, and we had a tremendous effect. It had nothing to do with our ability, our throughput. It had to do with the fact that we didn't have the constraints of all of these requirements that we superimposed on everybody else. And so my genuine hope is that AI, so that's been a personal interest of mine. I'm fascinated by the ability to interact. I think there will be a time in the near future where you'll have a telephone and be able to talk to an AI PT and give you the basics. I still don't think ultimately that will replace any PT. There's a movement afloat, what I call a displacement movement, that really thinks you can displace PT with technology. And I think that's sad. We take a very different approach. My approach is augmentation approach. I think you use these tools to help you get your hands on patients. Yeah. Let's face it, 80-90% of all PT will be done in a clinic in the future. That's not going to change. What will change is we have tools to help you in between your clinic spots from an accountability and everything else. You're going to see RFID and other kinds of technology be able to tell us very simply whether our patient did our exercise. Okay. You're going to wear this sensor to do the exercise. It'll automatically upload. I'll be able to remote monitor you. And if something goes wrong, I might get on the phone with you and say, you didn't do your at-home exercises there. You didn't do certain instructions. I think those tools are all great. But ultimately, a physical therapist's skills are neck up skills. They're cognitive skills. We have hands-on skills, but that's secondary to our neck up skills. And that's not going to be displaced by AI, but it could be augmented by AI.
Yeah, I mean, to me, I keep paying attention, and I mentioned biases. I come at things with a background in radio broadcasting, and really that's relationship building, right? That's high frequency over time. And I look at what AI is allowing, will allow like our professions like ours to do that, is to show, not tell, of value in frequency over time when the person doesn't necessarily need to just be in front of you. You can help from afar. But I think, someone has the great line where AI won't replace people. AI will replace people who don't embrace the technology that is being used and will allow them to have further reach and build relationships in the future.
No, I think that's right. And I also think it depends on your mindset's really important. So if you fundamentally think that PT can be displaced, you're looking at AI solutions very differently
Right.
than folks like myself and others that I'm teammates with who are looking at AI to help us augment or enhance the experience for the patient and ensure a better clinical outcome.
Yeah.
Very different in usage cases, that we're trying to model.
I was trying to explain it to a friend. I said, you can still chop the tree down with the axe. You can do that. But you have to understand that the world has been given, for better or worse, and again, this goes back to the tool analogy, a chainsaw or a machine with 10 chainsaws that drives around. So how will you use that? Can you use it for bad and good? The answer is yes.
Absolutely.
But hopefully we have enough people in our profession, and I think we do, to hopefully figure out how to amplify this tool.
No doubt.
All right. The last thing we do on the show, Larry, is called the parting shot. All right, parting shot brought to you by our friends from the Academy of Orthopedic Physical Therapy. Their current concepts of orthopedic physical therapy, if you want to go from wherever you are in your career to taking that current concept, or that OCS exam, find them online at orthopt.org. Parting shot, Larry, you just chanced for a mic drop moment, your soapbox statement. What would you want to leave with the audience today?
Yeah, I'd say there's three things I would want to get folks lined up on or aligned on. The first is that I do think physical therapists will be the focused access points for all things MSK, all aches, pains, sprains, and strains. It'll be multimodal, it'll be omnichannel, but in clinic, things will still happen in a clinic, but PTs will be that centric point for sure. I don't see the overall population health changing dramatically, even with the semaglutide drugs and medications. Right now we're at the 10 to 12%. I expect PT to be at 15 to 25% of MSK. Certainly hope so. So our growth rate will be profound, and how we address that challenge is something you and I just discussed. The last parting shot I would say is that reimbursement isn't all of a sudden going to suddenly change. Our fee-for-service models have increased the cost. It used to be called the Affordable Care Act, and it was called Obamacare. And I'm not trying to get political, but it's the last thing that it is affordable. Our healthcare costs are, they're obscene. And we are going to have to go to some type of alternative payment model. Now, notice I didn't say value-based care, where PTs are likely going to be paid alternatively based on a number of things. Could be risk triage. It could be access points, getting patients in, being able to avoid downstream pharma, imaging, surgery, all those kind of things. But as a physical therapist, we cannot withstand the decreased payments that we're getting in Medicare and Medicare Advantage and survive. And it's unfortunate that our patients who need us the most, the elderly, will have the least access because their payment system is screwed up. So the only way to course correct that is through some sense of alternative payment model, whether us as a value-added partner in it, some aspect of risk sharing, I don't know, but it has to change.
Yeah. And one of those we have more control over, right?
That's
Waiting
exactly
for someone else to wake up and decide we are valuable. To me, it's just it's going to take too long, if ever at all. One of those things you can pull a lever and have more results, and that's it's showing value and leaning into the larger than 15% that we're affecting now.
Absolutely.
Well, we've mentioned it several times. I don't think I need to push too hard, but if you'd like to follow this guy on social media at Physical Therapy, Larry, appreciate the time having a Miller Lite with me.
Absolutely. Thanks, Jimmy. You do a great job.